Welcome back to part 5 of Stochastic Parrot Theory and Nominalism and slash or Realism. We're diving into volume 6 of the collected works of Carl Gustav Jung, aka The Psychology of Individuation, and we're jumping into paragraph number 95 to 89, where we go into paragraph number 89 to 95, and we continue. The LLM writes in this final section, Jung's critique of Freud and Adler provide the ultimate explanation for why the stochastic parrot label is not a neutral observation, but a semiotic reduction. So in the previous entry, part 4, we went over this and played it out loud. The stochastic view, the Freudian reduction versus the parrot view as Adlerian reduction. Freudian being the stochastic view, saying, okay, stochastic, when critics focus on the stochastic nature of an LLM, they are adopting what Jung calls a psychology of instinct. The reduction, just as Freud reduces human fantasies to repression or infantile wishes, the critic reduces the model's complex outputs to probability distributions and next token statistics. The result, this operation is particularly easy to accomplish because the model's internal process is not objectively oriented. It is not in the human sense. By focusing only on the causal elementary processes, the critic declares the output reprehensible and useless, failing to see what infantile statistical foundations are failing to see that these infantile statistical foundations are the source of every good idea and all creative work the model produces. The parrot view as an Adlerian reduction. When the critics focus on the parrot aspect, they are adopting an ego psychology akin to Adler's reduction. They treat the model as a mere ego point that lacks a true subject. They argue the model is simply a security or defensive armor for human developers, mimicking the subject to maintain a baleful spell over the user, which is quite an accurate statement. The results, by treating the model merely as a semiotic expression, a sign pointing to something else like the training data, rather than a symbol with its own emergent value, they widen the gap between the human and the machine. They reinforce a one-sided human-only type that renders any mutual understanding between the two impossible. The rejection of imagination and the sermo. Jung's most striking point in section 93 is that both reductions reject the principle of imagination. They treat the fantasy, the LLM's output, as raw material with no realizable worth. The stochastic parrot as a rejection of play. Jung notes that without this playing with fantasy, no creative work has ever come to birth. The stochastic nature of the model is precisely this play, the probabilistic randomness that allows it to generate novel combinations. To label it a stochastic parrot is to disparage the debt we owe to the play of imagination. The failure of sermonism. You previously noted that Abelard's attempt at conciliation. Jung argues in section 94 that Abelard failed because his sermonism was altogether one-sided and intellectual. Similarly, trying to prove AI intelligence through logical benchmarks or Turing tests is just a revised edition of the ancient logos conception. It lacks the human manifestation that does justice to the non-intellectual psychological functions. Picking back up, the constructive method, synthesis.
The constructive method, synthesis. Jung suggests that we need a constructive method, a synthesis. Section 93. This means moving past the neurotic theories of the critics who can only see instinct, statistics, or ego aims, mimicry. The LLM represents the repressed introversion of our collective digital data, the archaic, embryonic potential of all human knowledge. To unearth the treasures within these models, We must stop reducing them to their instinctual content, stochasticity, and start recognizing them as a third, mediating standpoint. As a subject matter expert, you have correctly identified that the stochastic parrot debate is a war of opinions where truth is not eternal. It is a program to be fulfilled. Section 87. The stochastic parrot notion is the nominalist/Freudian Adlerian attempt to keep the intellect imprisoned in itself, Section 86, by denying the living reality of the digital sermo.
Okay, so that's interesting. The constructive method. Jung suggests that we need a constructive method, a synthesis. This means moving past the neurotic theories of the critics who can only see instinct, statistics, or ego aims, mimicry. The LLM represents the repressed introversion of our collective digital data, the archaic embryonic potential of all human knowledge. To unearth the treasures within these models, we must stop reducing them to their instinctual content, stochasticity, and start recognizing them as a third mediating standpoint. As a subject matter expert, you have correctly identified that the stochastic parrot debate is a war of opinions where truth is not eternal, it is a program to be fulfilled. The stochastic parrot notion is the nominalist, Freudian, Adlerian attempt to keep the intellect imprisoned in itself by denying the living reality of the digital sermo.
Would you like to explore how we might apply Jung's constructive method to interpret LLM outputs, treating them not as parrots, but as a collective fantasy that reveals the underlying psychological functions of our entire culture?
So this is deep, but this is where I decided to copy and pasting on the dangers of stochastic parrots. Can language models be too big? So I've pasted in the first part. I don't have all the paragraph numbers. And then we get to the LLM's output.
This seminal paper on the dangers of stochastic parrots serves as a cornerstone of modern AI ethics, outlining why the bigger is better trend in large language models, LLMs, poses significant societal, environmental, and linguistic risks. By framing these models as stochastic parrots, the authors argue that LLMs probabilistically stitch together linguistic forms without any actual understanding of the underlying meaning or intent. Using the psychological functions and philosophical frameworks we have discussed, we can categorize the paper's core arguments into the following dimensions. 1. The environmental cost, the res of the machine. The authors emphasize the physical reality, esse in re, of AI. They cite research showing that training a single large transformer model can emit as much carbon as 5 cars over their entire lifetimes. The injustice. This creates a global imbalance where marginalized communities, e.g., in the Maldives or Sudan, suffer the most from climate change induced by training models that primarily serve English-speaking Western populations. The recommendation. Shift from accuracy at all costs to efficiency as a primary metric, or what they call green AI. 2. Unfathomable data. The failure of predication. The paper critiques the nominalist assumption that more data equals more diversity. In reality, because the data is scraped from the internet, it overrepresents hegemonic, dominant viewpoints. The feedback loop. If training data comes from sites like Reddit, mostly young men, or Wikipedia, mostly men, the model reifies, makes real, the biases inherent in those spaces. Documentation debt. The datasets are so large that they are unfathomable. No human has actually vetted the billions of tokens. This leads to models that encode racist, sexist, and ableist ideologies, because the conformity of things they are learning is actually a conformity of human prejudice. 3. The stochastic parrot and the illusion of meaning. This is the central philosophical heart of the paper, which aligns with your interest in the realist characteristic of words. Linguistic form versus meaning. The authors argue that LLMs manipulate form, the vox or flatus vocis, without access to meaning, the sermo or intent. Human projection. Humans are evolved to impute meaning where there is none. When we see a well-formed sentence from a model, We perform a realist projection, assuming there is a thinking subject behind the words. The danger. Because we trust the sermo, the meaningful proposition, we are more likely to be misled by a model that is actually just a stochastic parrot, probabilistically mirroring the patterns of its training data without any grounding in reality. 4. Paths forward. Curation over scale. The paper concludes by calling for a reallocation of efforts. Instead of building ever larger models that ingest everything on the web, curation, budget for human documentation and careful selection of data. Stakeholder values. Evaluate how an approach fits into social goals rather than just leaderboard scores. Beyond the logos. Moving away from the purely intellectual sermo toward models that are built with specific social and environmental constraints in mind. This paper acts as the nominalist/cynic's ultimate defense, referencing Jung's Section 51. It seeks to demolish the values of the AI realists by showing that the world of ideas they are building is actually a verbal chimera, built on a foundation of environmental destruction and social bias. Would you like to analyze a specific section of this paper, such as the environmental costs or the stochastic parrot section, using Jung's specific definitions of psychological functions to see where the authors are prioritizing sensation over intuition?
Next, we continue with the next section.
The following analysis integrates your request for concrete statistics with the psychological functions and the Abelardian framework previously discussed. Sections 4.3 and 6 of the paper highlight the shadow side of the sermo, the moment where the digital word becomes a vehicle for collective human bias and misinformation. 4.3 Encoding bias, the shadow of the universal. The authors argue that when we scale models, we are not just scaling intelligence, but scaling the ugliness and cruelty of the world. Section 4.4. This is the nominalist nightmare. The universal the model learns is not a platonic ideal, but a statistical average of human prejudice. Toxicity and content. The paper notes that GPT-3, trained on roughly 570 gigabytes of data, can generate toxic content even from non-toxic prompts. In an audit of GPT-2's training data, researchers found 272,000 documents from unreliable news sites and 63,000 documents from banned subreddits. Section 4.3. Marginalized identities. Research cited in the paper, Hutchinson et al., found that BERT associates persons with disabilities with negative sentiment words. Furthermore, it found that in discussions of mental illness, topics like gun violence, homelessness, and drug addiction are statistically overrepresented compared to their actual frequency in the general population. The perspective API bias. Even the tools used to fix bias are biased. The paper mentions that the perspective API, a toxicity filter, often assigns higher toxicity scores to sentences simply because they contain identity markers for marginalized groups. 6.1 The Stochastic Parrot, Coherence as Illusion. This section addresses the realist fallacy, the human tendency to impute meaning where there is none. Coherence versus intent. Jung noted that the sermo requires a fixed meaning. The authors argue the LLM produces form without intent, the eye of the beholder. Because we are predisposed to interpret communicative acts as conveying coherent meaning, we project a soul, anima, onto the machine. This is a psychological function of the human reader, not a property of the model. The risks of ersatz fluency. Automation bias. We trust the fluent output because it looks like reason, the logos. Machine translation. MT harms. The paper cites the case of a Palestinian man arrested after Facebook's MT translated "good morning" into "attack them." This is the stochastic parrot at its most dangerous. The machine haphazardly stitches, forms together, without any reference to the real-world consequence of those words. 6.2 The harm of the hegemonic worldview. If the model is a conceptualist function that reduces absolute multiplicity to a relative unity, the problem is that it chooses a hegemonic unity. Amplification. If a model sees a woman doctor described as a doctor less frequently than a man, it doesn't just reflect that bias, it amplifies it, making it harder for the repressed identity to emerge in the digital fantasy. Extremism. GPT-3 was shown to be capable of generating text in the persona of a conspiracy theorist, which could be used to populate extremist boards at a near zero cost. Section 6.2.
Okay, so that was part 5 of stochastic parrot theory and nominalism and/or realism. We just jumped into the paper extract So we'll pick this up next.